I really am glad that so many of you found a way back here to the forum. It's the first time for you probably to hear me speak English here, but this is like for a very special cause, because today we have the inaugural English lecture of the first Mannheim Forum International Day. After the following speech and Q&A session, I would very kindly ask you to please remain seated in here, because we would like to take a picture of all you guys here, of all our participants. But we're going to come back to that later, and we are going to present you the Mannheim Forum 2016 film with the statements of the speakers that we got so far. We also got yours. I'm not sure whether they already figured to put it in, but they will afterwards. They're still cutting, and they will continue cutting the film. So this will be like, a version in between. So welcome to the final main event of the 2016 Mannheim Forum. This year's special session is extra special, as I already said, because it's the first time ever we are offering part of the program in English. Today is the inaugural International Day, as I already said, and I would like to extend a special welcome to all the international students that are here with us. So there are about 25 or 30 international students who came for the Mannheim Forum for the first time. Hello. Those students have, among others, joined us today to participate in 2 English language workshops. I'm very glad to also have Dr. David Post here, who held one of the workshops. And also to attend this special session. This session is also special in that it brings us back to where we started the forum on Thursday evening. Bundestag President, Professor Dr. Lammert, addressed the topic of the refugee crisis in his opening speech. And we will now have the opportunity to bring the Mannheim Forum to a close by discussing the topic from a European perspective. So we first had the German perspective, now we're moving on to the European perspective. This subject is a particularly relevant aspect of the theme without borders, and perhaps the most obvious embodiment of the questions that arise when one thinks about the topic of refugees. What is the meaning of borders in a world where 60 million people are currently displaced from their homes? 60 million people. How can European countries address the biggest refugee crisis since World War II? I am pleased that Natascha Berthaud from the European Commission is here with us today to help us discuss and debate precisely these questions. After her speech, there will be a Q&A session, and I think you are happy to take some questions afterwards. Ms. Berthaud, I would like to introduce you to Ms. Berthaud. You are a spokesperson at the European Commission, covering the activities of the President, Jean-Claude Juncker, and the policies of the first Vice President, Franz Timmermans, and the topics of migration and the refugee crisis, among others. So you are the youngest spokesperson ever to work for the European Commission. Today, you are here to speak on the European response to the refugee crisis. That is actually what your lecture is about. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Ms. Natascha Berthaud.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So let me start by saying thank you very much for having me today, and thank you for letting me speak English. I think you wouldn't appreciate it if I did try to speak German. It wouldn't be so comprehensible. Although I did enjoy the previous session. I understood about 50% of it. So I'm a spokesperson, as you introduced me, and what that normally means is that I write speeches for other people. I don't normally deliver them myself. So you'll forgive me also if I find this experience a little bit novel today. So my job, amongst other things, is to communicate about migration, to explain day in and day out, mostly to journalists, about what the European Union is doing to address the worst refugee crisis that the world has seen since the Second World War. No pressure. As you can imagine, it doesn't really involve me getting a lot of sleep, but I'm happy to sacrifice more of that sleep to come here today, because I think it's really important to talk to students, to talk to people about policies that we're making today, and the rationale behind that policy making when it's going to be you making those decisions in the future. So the title of my intervention is indeed the European response to the refugee crisis, but allow me to make a small distinction about what we talk about when we say European. I represent the European Commission, but the European Commission is not Europe. Europe is 28 member states, often with varied opinions of how things should be done, and each coming at a topic with very different national perspectives. And the Commission has the great misfortune of having to try and take all of these perspectives into account and try to stick together kind of bigger picture solutions. And if you pick up any newspaper, and I genuinely hope that you do read newspapers, if that's one recommendation I could make to you, is read newspapers, but don't believe everything they say. But if you do read those newspapers, you'll see that when it comes to migration, the countries of the European Union do not always see eye to eye. And finding a common response out of those different positions is not always easy. It is, however, very, very necessary. Because if you look at the media, the way that they are portraying the refugee crisis at the moment, some are saying this is the end of the European Union. Where is European solidarity on this issue? And for me, this reminds me very much, as I was also still working for the European Commission at this time, about how media reported on the financial and debt crisis. And either it's just that journalists have a real flair for the dramatic, or apparently they know more about the situation than we do. Because I remember the time when every newspaper had the headline, Euro doomed, the EU is on the brink of collapse. And it's a very European affliction to always think so negatively of ourselves. Because a few years later, the euro is alive and well. Our economies are rebounding. Investment is on the rise, and we expect 2% growth this year. But there are no headlines on this, because good news doesn't sell. And a striking example for me was the Davos Economic Forum. This is a forum that's held every year in snowy cabins in Switzerland. And for the first time in years, the European commissioners and the heads of state and government that went to represent the European Union, they came with a positive economic story to tell. Finally, they should have been able to stand tall next to our international partners and say, hey, look how well we're doing, finally. But instead, what they found was pity. Pity in the eyes of the world for a Europe that is plagued by a refugee crisis. And that is not right. We should stand a little bit taller, and we should have a little bit more faith, because the refugee crisis is a crisis not only that Europe can, but that Europe must manage collectively. And there is no reason why any crisis, and particularly not the refugee crisis, should bring into question the purpose or the viability of the European Union. Because it is precisely the European Union that is the unique forum which allows all of our nations to come together, to find solutions, to share resources, and to show solidarity. It's the forum that we express our frustration and anger in. Sometimes we do see more division than we do unity, but these are the arguments of a family. However loud and hostile they may sound at times, they do not question why we're together in the first place. And the European Union has never been more necessary than it is today, and never more so than on the issue of the refugee crisis. So that just leaves one question to answer. How do we solve the refugee crisis from a European perspective? I'd like to say that there's one simple solution. There's not. There's no magic cure, no sleight of hand, no one set of European Council conclusions that are going to bring a once-and-for-all solution to this issue. Instead, there are lots of very different actions that all need to be taken in parallel. A lot of them are unpopular, some of them are painful, some of them see European nations divided on the issues. But above all, this is something that's going to take time. Migration has and will continue to be one of the defining issues for Europe for the coming decades. Because if you look at the trends in economic development, climate change, globalization, or the war and instability in our neighboring regions, all this means that people are going to continue to come to Europe to seek refuge or just to seek a better life. So this is not an issue that's going away anytime soon. And I think we have to be honest about this, because as long as there's war in Syria, as long as there's instability in Libya, people and refugees will continue to make their way to the European Union. And so to address this, what the European Union has been doing most recently, since the beginning of the Juncker Commission, even for the past 5 years, has been putting in place the building blocks of what could be a sustainable solution for managing migration in Europe. And the way I'd like to describe this to you is to take you through a geographical approach. This is not a temporal approach, because a lot of these things, some of the ones we did first were the things we did closer to home. But I'll take you through it geographically and try and paint a kind of picture of what this European approach is supposed to be. So, ideal scenario, we stop there being a need for people to leave their homes in the first place. But without getting into a lengthy foreign policy discussion, I think that you can agree with me that this is perhaps still a work in progress, particularly when it comes to resolving the crisis in Syria. So without having solved the crisis and the war in Syria, the next thing that we need to do is look at the countries around Syria, so Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and help refugees where they are. And this is why we're providing humanitarian aid to these 3 countries. The European Union collectively is the biggest donor to the Syrian refugee crisis, having given over 5 billion already. And just a couple of weeks ago at the London Pledging Conference, the European Union together pledged another 3 billion to help Syrian refugees. And maybe just a little anecdote on Jordan and Lebanon. If you ever wanted to understand President Juncker's thinking when he thinks about the refugee crisis and his approach to it, I always think of the story that he told me when he went to meet the King of Jordan. And he listened for an hour for his explanation of what the situation is in Jordan. He's done the same with the leaders in Lebanon and Turkey. And he listened to the troubles and the challenges that they are facing as individual countries. And he says to me after the meeting, I don't know how to look myself in the mirror and say to the King of Jordan, that who has a country where 25% of the population now are refugees, and say that the European Union cannot deal with having less than 1% of our population being composed of refugees. So I think there's a common understanding amongst, certainly in the institutions and amongst the member states, that we cannot leave Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey alone in dealing with the refugee crisis when they're already doing so much. So part of the... Thanks. So the next thing that we need to do then is resettle people. So help alleviate some of the pressure on these countries by taking some of the refugees and bringing them to Europe. This is what we call resettlement. And the European member states back in June last year agreed collectively to resettle 22,000 people from these 3 countries. To date, member states have resettled 4,000 of that 22,000. And when you think that there are 2.6 million refugees in Turkey alone, it's not enough, and more needs to be done. And the consequence is what brings me to the next step on our geographical journey here. The consequence is that you have people from Turkey, refugees from Turkey, crossing the Aegean to make their way into the European Union by their own means. And what we need to do to tackle this problem is firstly to stop what is a very dangerous and irregular flow. We've had more success with the flows that we saw coming from Libya at the beginning of last year, when we tripled our presence at sea. We set up a European maritime operation essentially to rescue people losing their lives at sea. We've done the same in the Aegean. The problem with the Aegean being that this is historically a very porous border. Between Lesbos and the Turkish coast, it's not even 6 kilometers. It's very difficult to have a full surveillance of this coastal line. and which is why we need to work with Turkey. The European Union together needs to build a relationship with Turkey to be partners in managing this flow. So that's why in November, member states met with Turkey and they agreed a joint action plan, which notably includes the application of what is called a readmission agreement. Now, readmission agreements are frameworks that countries have with, European countries, for example, have with third countries to send back people who have crossed illegally or irregularly into their territory. Greece already had a readmission agreement with Turkey. It was signed in 2002, and it's been in force since 2013. But between 2013 and 2015, only 8 people were returned from Greece. So it wasn't working very well. And this has something to do, obviously, with the particular relations between Greece and Turkey. And this is where the European Union could make a difference. This is where the European Union and the European Commission and its institutions stepped in to secure a deal whereby Turkey would accept the people that have crossed irregularly and who do not have a right to international protection, who are not in need of asylum, that they can be sent back to Turkey and from there to their countries of origin. And so this is starting to work. Last week, there were about 300 people returned. Yesterday, another 100. And the idea is to do this systematically. And this is also part of what you may have seen in the newspapers of late, what is being negotiated with the Turks now, and what is going to be the subject of another summit, because we have one every week now, that is taking place in Brussels next Thursday and Friday. The point and the purpose of this cooperation is primarily to stop people drowning in the Aegean. And one element of that response has been the launching of a NATO operation, so that is now working in the Aegean. We already had a European operation. The Frontex is the European Border Agency, but it really has its limits. It can only operate in Greek waters. It can't go into Turkish waters. It relies on the willingness of individual member states to send border guards and to send boats and ships to Greece when they feel that they might need them themselves to deal with their aspect of the refugee crisis. And so what we have also, in a longer-term vision, put on the table is a proposal for a European border and coast guard. We proposed this in December. It still hasn't been agreed by the member states, but this is something that could, in the future, provide a longer-term solution. And in the meantime, we have NATO, and we're making full use of it. So the other part of the deals that we are working out with Turkey is the readmission of Syrians as well. And I know that this has been slightly controversial in that normally the philosophy and that is in the treaties, in European law and international law, is we do not turn away people when they arrive in our countries and ask for asylum. This is the basis of the Geneva Convention. We do not practice what is called pushbacks. There is, however, a legal way in which we could agree with Turkey to send back Syrians who would qualify for international protection to Turkey on the understanding that we would resettle someone also of Syrian nationality from Turkey. And what you're doing there is creating a disincentive. You are making it not profitable for smugglers or for an individual to pay a smuggler 1,000 euros to cross in a dinghy over the Aegean, when all it will result in is you being sent back. And these are quite cruel business models that are being run with smugglers. And up until now, we've had great difficulty in stopping them. And this is the purpose of the deal that is now being worked out, is to do that, is to really create a disincentive for people to risk their lives and to have proper, orderly resettlement from Turkey instead. In the meantime, as that is still not fully operational, what we do have is an irregular flow of people into Greece. So that's the next step on our geographical journey, is Greece. And what we have been seeking to do now for several years is install an orderly management of people. So when they arrive, people need to be registered. They need to be security screened. I think that the recent terrorist attacks and the experiences that all of us have felt over the past year it wouldn't be a surprise to you that security checks are of particular concern for many member states. So this is something that needs to happen to everyone who arrives. And then they need to be channeled into one of two procedures. For people who need international protection, you need to give them asylum. For people who do not need international protection, you need to return them to their home countries. Not as easy as said, because as I was just trying to say with the readmission agreement, a country has to accept their national back. You can't just put a Moroccan on a plane and say, good luck. Morocco has to say, I accept that this person is of Moroccan nationality and we will accept them back into the country. So this involves readmission agreements with third countries all over the world, and this is what the European Union collectively has the clout to negotiate as a whole, and which individual member states have had difficulty doing by themselves. Then you have, the hotspots. I wanted to say a little word about the hotspots because I think you may have heard that term, which no one really understands. But what that is this orderly system in Greece for managing and registering and fingerprinting everyone who arrives and to channeling them into these different procedures. This was not an easy thing to have set up. It took time. Some say that Greece was too slow. Some say that Greece did everything that it could at that time. I'm not going to get into the judgment. The point is that now, as of today, Greece has done everything that we have asked them to in setting up hotspots in each of the Greek islands along the Aegean to ensure that everyone who does arrive is properly treated and registered. Then, in the geographical journey, we're still in Greece. What do you do when there are still 2,000 to 3,000 people arriving per day in Greece? You cannot leave Greece alone to deal with this either, because Greece should not be the one who has to bear the brunt of what is a collective European responsibility. And so the next point I'd like to talk to you about is what I started with, European solidarity. When the numbers are too high for individual countries to cope with alone, such as Greece before it was Italy, we have to alleviate some of that burden. Just as we're doing with Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, we have to alleviate the burden from our own European member states. And that is why we came up with what's called the relocation scheme. The relocation scheme, member states agreed back in September to relocate 160,000 people from Greece and Italy. When you look at the numbers, they don't quite match the 2,000 to 3,000 that are arriving per day. And the system was slow to be set up. The consequence is that people relocated themselves. People were walking essentially through Europe, and most of the time to Germany, through the Western Balkans, through several European member states. We saw a quite chaotic situation. As of this morning, Greece has sent over 500 requests to other European member states asking them to relocate people, and these requests have still not received a response. In the meantime, now that the Western Balkan people are not moving along the Western Balkan route anymore, I will not get into why, a humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Greece. And the Commission is on the ground. We have an office of about 50 people permanently working with the Greek authorities. We have European agencies, Frontex, the European Asylum Support Office, that are supporting the Hellenic Coast Guard, that are supporting the Hellenic Asylum Office to help alleviate the humanitarian situation there. We're working with international partners like the International Organization for Migration, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, are all there working on the ground. Last week, we put on the table a 700 million humanitarian aid package, which is essentially destined for Greece. However, these are expressions of European solidarity to a European member state, Greece. But this solidarity in Europe has been somewhat frayed of late. You may have noticed that a small number of member states have reintroduced temporary controls under the Schengen Border Code. This is not a suspension of Schengen. This is allowed by the rules. There are the people who made these rules were clever enough to think that something like this might happen. So there is a provision that you can temporarily have controls at internal Schengen borders. This is not a situation that can last, however. it is understandable that whilst you don't have full control of the external borders, you cannot have an area of free movement inside the European Union. But it is not, so until external controls are properly reinforced, until we have a proper control of the external border in Greece, it makes sense to have these checks in between European member states. But it's not something that can last. It is not something that can last because it will be devastating for the internal market. There are 1.7 million people cross-border commuting, so people who live in Luxembourg and are going to work in France, or people who live in Strasbourg and are coming across to Germany. And when you look at the transport, there are 52 million cross-border transports, so trucks going between different European countries transporting goods every year. And if you think that it costs about 50 euros for every 30 minutes that a truck is left waiting at a border and is not able to get across because of the checks, just think about the economic cost of what internal controls in Schengen are costing our economies. So this is something that the European Commission is working to make sure comes to an end. We came forward last week with what we call the Roadmap Back to Schengen. It's a snappy name, and what it is meant to achieve, however, is concrete steps that Greece can take, that European Union member states can take, to make sure that by the end of this year, we lift those controls again, and we do not jeopardize what is one of the crowning achievements of the European Union, is our area of free movement and our internal market. So if solidarity has not been easy to achieve, it also has not been sufficient. It is still the case that there are a small number of member states that are shouldering the largest burden of the refugee crisis, and Germany is one of the countries at the top of that list. It is still the case that the humanitarian face of Europeans has shone brightest in Greek islands and in German train stations. But even if some are slower to turn on their lights, it does not mean that those lights should dim in Greece or in Germany or in the ones that are shining them brighter than others. Because it's only when European nations work together that we can really move mountains. We have collectively, the European Union, a moral and legal obligation to offer a safe haven to those who need it. This is enshrined in our laws, this is enshrined in international law, the Geneva Convention that I talked about briefly, and in European law. Just one word maybe on the Geneva Convention. Why does this exist? It exists because after 2 devastating world wars, European nations stood together and they said, never again will we allow this situation to happen. And we cannot go back on that now. And we are really not shooting for the stars when we apply just this basic principle of international law of granting protection to those who need it. And in fact, most national and European laws go well beyond that in the terms the protection and the generosity of that protection that they offer. So I do not see how this can now be rowed back without jeopardizing our principles and indeed the very nature of what the European Union is. And so to quote the President, as I do so like to do, there needs to be more Europe in our union and more union in Europe. So as you can see, and just in this brief talking you through, and I've really only scratched the surface of what are quite complex issues, both legally and morally. I'm sure that it's been the case that you maybe don't agree with your neighbor on this, you don't agree with your family on this. What is a topic that everyone has an opinion about? But there are so many different elements to it, and they all need to come together. But what cannot be is that you have individual national responses to what is a innately European problem. And it cannot be that in the European Union of 2016, which is a beacon of democracy and fundamental rights worldwide, that European nations would allow people to drown at sea, to trek across borders in freezing temperatures, or to sleep in fields. And it cannot be that a handful of countries alone bear the economic and societal costs of the entire European Union's collective responsibility in addressing the refugee crisis that Europe is facing. And this is why we need this European response to the refugee crisis. And this is why, for me, for the European Commission, for the President, there is only a European response to the refugee crisis. you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Berthaud. I'm not on the microphone yet, okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Berthaud, for that excellent speech. I think you pointed out a very clear way of how Europe has to address this crisis, whereas you also differentiated it between Europe and the European Union. I think you are happy now to take a few questions, so just raise your hands, please, and I will bring a microphone to you. Okay, there's one. Once again, who was it? Here. Einmal durchgehen, bitte.
So I got a question for you from a different angle. So you, as the spokesperson for the European Commission, present their positions every day, and to some degree you stand for them with your name and your face. So I would like to, if you think about situations where your personal opinion was at odds with what you presented, how do you deal with such a situation personally? How do you cope with that?
Yeah, I think that's the spokesperson's dilemma, is that you're not working for yourself. Everything that you say is representative for someone else. And that's the job. I don't have a personal opinion when it comes to my job, and I don't think it would be right for me to have a personal opinion. However, particularly in working for President Juncker, I did his election campaign. That's when I first started working for him, and I have always found that personally my politics really do not differ very much from his, so I've never found it to be very hard to get on board with the policies that he or the European Commission is presenting. But we're not always so lucky.
Just 1 second. I would like to repair this. You lost it during your speech.
Oh, sorry. Was that me?
No, it wasn't you. It was just...
Woo!
Next question, please.
I actually have 2 questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
Number 1, what do you expect to result from the summit next week? And number 2, if the European Commission is working together with the US and Canada to address the refugee crisis, or if there is a form of cooperation there.
Yep, sure. So the summit next week, the hope is to have a deal with Turkey along the lines of what I sketched out. So we have an agreement in principle was reached this week on Monday at the summit that we had with Turkey, where we would have basically a closure of the irregular crossings from Turkey into Greece across the Aegean by different means. One of them is readmission, and the other is through resettlement directly from Turkey. So this is what the details of this should be sketched out during this week, and President Tusk is doing a tour essentially of European member states to work out the details on this deal, and that's what hopefully should come out of the summit next week. I think there are very good chances for it. We were already quite far on Monday, but it's, as ever, it takes a little bit of time sometimes to bring all the different parties around the table. On cooperation, global cooperation on the refugee crisis, yes, this is something that we are actively pursuing, notably in fora like the G20, where we are asking our international and global partners to do their part too. I'm not going to say that their activism has been huge up until this point, but there was a particularly moving speech by the Prime Minister of Canada at the Davos Economic Forum, which I seem to be doing an advert for now, where he made a very good point about it being in Canada's economic interest to accept refugees and to integrate them into their society. And if that's the philosophy that our global partners are approaching the issue in, then we can very much get on board with that. And we are working with them, and in all of our bilateral relations, we do ask them to be somewhat more forthcoming in their resettlement of refugees.
Thank you.
Hello. You pointed out that the questions and the problems we are facing are very complex. And now I'm asking myself, how is it possible to communicate the responses the EU is taking and all those complex problems to people who are maybe not, who can't maybe speak English or are not have the chance to sit here at such a conference, but are in their home states, in their towns, and just seeing that the world is changing and kind of feeling that they can't do anything about it, and people who don't understand all those complex things which are going on and who are seeking for a simple solution.
Well, that's basically my job, so is to try and communicate very complex issues in more simple terms. The media that I go through are essentially the press, and in the press room in the European Commission has the largest mix of journalists and the most accredited journalists that any institution in the world has. We're the only institution in the world that does a daily press conference, my joy, every day at 12, where we answer any question that anyone asks us. It's not like the White House, for example, does bi-weekly press briefings. They have a much smaller accreditation room, much smaller than this, where they take a few questions on given topics. The European Commission every day has a room twice this size, full of journalists asking us whatever they want to, which is tricky. When you have to predict what they're going to ask you in the morning and try and come up with a response. That's the means that we can go through in Brussels. We also have offices in all 28 member states where they communicate more to the national media in their language. We translate everything we do. We have interpreters for everything we do. So there is, in terms of language barriers, I don't think that that's the biggest issue that we face. But we also very much rely on the member states, because who better to communicate to their publics and their citizens what the European Union is taking as decisions than the member states themselves. So I think there's a joint responsibility. The difficulty is when they're not quite communicating the same thing. And there we're at a significant disadvantage because they have a captive audience. So take a national minister has a very captive audience who can communicate directly in the language and is much closer to them. So their message will definitely get across a lot quicker than a European one will. But more and more, this is becoming a joint effort. And with new technologies as well, you cannot say something in Greece and then say a different thing in Germany anymore. There is instant wires on every time someone is quoted, you'll have a wire on it and then newspaper articles. And so there is this kind of global communication that goes very quickly across Europe that is able to get the different messages that we're trying to get across.
Hello. My question would be about something you, kind of scratched in the beginning of your speech. In an ideal world, we always think about long-term solutions, being proactive. But in the end, one thing, for example, Norbert Lammert said in his speech on Thursday, he said people and politics can only react always on consternation, for example, when people are shocked. So talking about proactive possibilities, do you have maybe a personal or another proposal how you could address these, or how you could have solutions for these problems in the long term, so that you can not only react but be proactive and have long-term solutions, so that the people in these countries and the relevant countries have better lives there?
Well, short-termism is a problem in politics in general, and in fact, President Juncker, having worked with him for so long now, in his election campaign, he was one of the few people around the table who was saying, hey guys, migration, this is going to be an issue. We need to put this on the table. He ran his entire election campaign on the issue of migration. And then when he took office, the events kind of surpassed us. There was this, I don't know if you remember, around April last year, a boat sank in the Mediterranean with about 700 people on board. And the humanitarian reaction within European public opinion meant that a lot of leaders, a lot of ministers were suddenly taking up this issue a lot more publicly than they had in the past. And I remember standing in the European Parliament, and Juncker said, you know, thank you so much that you're all applauding me when I talk about migration. Are you still going to be doing it in 3 months? They weren't, to put it bluntly, because public opinion then changed. And the European Commission has the advantage of having 5-year mandates, so we're not dependent on the same kind of electoral pressures that individual member states are, and so that does allow us to provide more longer-term visions, which is why right from the beginning, I mean, we have what we call the European Agenda on Migration. It's a 5-year plan. It includes things like a European border and coast guard. It includes things like legal migration from Africa. It includes things like integration packages, because what you do, fine, we're dealing with the emergency now, but what you do 5 years from now when these people need integrating into societies and educating and language learning and all of these things, these are all aspects that we are not only aware of, but are providing solutions on. The problem at the moment and in the last year has been that we have been so stuck in dealing with the emergencies, because the emergencies have kept piling on top of each other, that there hasn't been much time for longer-term discussions. We are supposed to, this week, come forward with our long-term vision of Dublin. So Dublin is the European asylum system. It's how we determine which member state is responsible for an asylum claim. And it is currently based on the principle of first country of entry. So the first country you arrive in is the person who's responsible for your asylum claim. And that's what allows you, for someone who arrives in Greece and who crosses to Croatia, you can send them back to Greece. That is what the current system is geared for, and as you can see, it's not quite fit for purpose when you have so many people arriving in a few countries of first entry. So we're supposed to present our grand vision for for changing this week, but the question is that a discussion that we can have now? Is that I'm not sure that there's a political appetite to have that discussion this week, maybe next week, but these are things that have to work in parallel. But it's true that of late we are really in crisis management. You're right.
You talked about the European solution, and like when you look at Eastern European states, like for example Poland, what would you do to make sure they like also take refugees, or that they work with the rest of the European Union to support these solutions?
Well, they sit around the table. And so when we take these decisions, they're not taken by a few member states and imposed on others. They are taken collectively. And when I said that we agreed on a relocation scheme to take 160,000 people from Italy and Greece and move them to other member states, that's a legally binding council decision. It was proposed by the Commission, but the member states sat down and they adopted it. They adopted it by qualified majority, which means that not all of them voted for it. There were a few that voted against it. You might guess who they are. Some of them are now challenging that very decision before the European Court of Justice. That does not change the fact that this is legally binding European law and that they are obliged to accept their proportion of that 160,000 of refugees from Greece and from Italy. And the Commission, as the guardian of the treaties, the European Court of Justice as the enforcer, has the means to enforce these decisions. Is that politically viable? I don't think so. We can do it, but the method that we prefer to pursue is one of diplomacy, one of working with all of our European member states and not excluding them when they have very different constraints, very different opinions, very different public opinions that are constraining them. And so what we try and do is create that bridge between different countries. And that's why we have all of these summits where we bring them all together around the table, is precisely so that they can find some aspects, at least, which they can find common ground on.
Okay. Hello. You were pointing out how important the work with Turkey is. However, there's some talking going on that this mass readmission might be illegal. If that is going to be true, what would be possible consequences?
Well, we're not going to do anything illegal. I think I can start on that premise. That it's true, mass expulsions are illegal. No one said that's what we wanted to do. There are provisions under quite detailed I mean, I can get into it. I'm not sure that's really going to answer your question or if it's going to bore you. But there is a European legislation that allows you to declare a country a safe third country. It allows you that to send back someone who would normally qualify for international protection from your country to, say, Turkey, on the understanding that they are able to seek asylum there. And this is what I mean about following the logic of the Geneva Convention, because what the Geneva Convention says is that everyone who needs protection should get it. It does not say where they should get it. In fact, it actually says that they should get it to the closest place to where they are. So there is a certain logic in people being able to claim asylum in a country neighboring Syria and not having the right to choose where they claim asylum. And this is not only a message that we are trying to pass, but something that we do need to enforce if we are going to bring any kind of order into the situation. So that's what we're trying to do. As I said, create a disincentive for people to cross illegally into Greece. But rest assured that whatever we do, and the details are now being worked out this week, will not only respect European law, but it will respect international law. That is a commitment that the Commission, that the President has taken very seriously. And what that means is there needs to be a number of safeguards and appeal procedures integrated into this system.
Hi. How much of a threat do you think the French election 2017 is for the European Union and consequently the whole solution of the refugee crisis with Le Pen possibly winning it?
Well, the European Commission doesn't tend to see elections as a threat, but rather as a normal expression of democracy. And there is a tendency, and this is what's quite fun about seeing it from a European perspective, is that we have elections in different European countries every month. And for some, they would like to paralyze the entire system. We have a referendum in the United Kingdom. Let's just stop working until that's over. We have elections in Germany. Let's just not adopt any new legislation until they're over. That's not the way the European Union works, because there are always going to be elections, and that's a good thing. That's democracy. So I don't think that we have any particular fear about any elections, let alone the French ones. What is worrying is the rise of right-wing and extremist parties across the European Union. And this is not unique to France alone at all. And that is something that we very much have to bear in mind, and particularly on the issue of the refugee crisis. Because what are the duties of a state? A state has a duty to protect fundamental rights, to respond to that humanitarian side of things, but it also has a duty to maintain legal order, security, justice, and protect its own citizens. And so there has to be, so each member state has to find their own kind of balance in the system, and this is part of why we are pursuing a policy of trying to stop a huge flow of migrants into the European Union that public opinion is not currently supporting. So there has to be a balance.
Thank you very much for your last sentences. This really follows my train of thought. I'm speaking of the situation in the northern African states, where we utilize and heavily rely on Morocco border police, which kind of distract, or let's say keep away with brutality and violence the refugees from entering the Spanish exclaves. If reality clashes this way with your ideals, How can you sleep at night?
Well, thank you for that. Again, as I'm not the architect of these policies, I actually sleep fine. But actually, no, it's not true because I don't sleep because I'm always working. But I think the people that are trying to design these policies have to take it with a certain dose of realism. There are humanitarian prerogatives, legal and moral obligations that we feel, the European Commission feels very strongly about. But at the same time, you have to take into account the reality of what is going to be acceptable to public opinion, to European citizens, and how far you can go, and how much you need to tailor measures to what is going to be acceptable to the people who are electing you in the first place. So that I think that in anything you do, it's great to have ideals, but you also have to have realism, and at some point they have to meet. When it comes to Morocco, the European Union has for decades been trying to conclude a readmission agreement with Morocco. We are unable to conclude a readmission agreement with Morocco. So Spain has a bilateral cooperation with them. This is not something that we have been able to do, and in fact, diplomatic relations with Morocco are currently suspended. So these are challenges that we try to resolve at European level, but I don't think that anyone can get out of their head any of the images that we are seeing of late at borders, whether they be outside the European Union or in it. Well, when I do get to sleep, I appreciate it very much. So.
As you already said, there's already a reallocation scheme in place, but that only covers a very small percentage of the actual refugees coming into Europe. So I was wondering if you have the expectation that in the near future there's going to be a reallocation scheme that actually covers a sufficient number of refugees in order to alleviate kind of the pressure of countries such as Greece, etc., when a lot of European countries seem not too willing to take in a lot of refugees, like over the actual amount that's currently coming in?
Yes, I do. And the reason that I do feel that way is because in recent days, because of the humanitarian situation that we're facing in Greece, member states have started to drastically pick up the number of people that they are relocating under this scheme. So when you think that these decisions were adopted in September, up until a month ago, about 400 people had been relocated from Italy and Greece. Part of that was because it took some time to set up the procedures in both Italy and Greece, and then more recently it became a problem of other member states not being quick enough themselves in accepting it. But in the space of 3 weeks, we've doubled that number. And we're working very hard with countries to keep doubling that every week. And in every single set of European Council conclusions for the past 3 months, there has been, we will urgently undertake relocation. So I can only believe that European member states will stick to what they have committed to doing.
Thank you. And do you think that there could ever be a sort of democratically elected head of state of the European Union? And do you think that solutions could be found more easily?
Sorry?
More easily, the solutions could be found more easily with the head of state?
Well, I think we've already come a long way in the last European elections, because these were the first ones where there was even a link between the election of the President of the European Commission and the results of the European Parliament elections. This is the first time that we had campaigns at European level. I'm not going to lie to you, they weren't spectacular. No one had ever done this before, and it was a bit of a we'll see how it goes experience. We'll make it up as we go along, and the link is not so direct. It's when you vote for your CDU member of parliament, you're voting for the EPP party in the European Union, and therefore you're going to have Juncker as the head of the Commission. So the link is not super. You don't have Juncker's name on a ballot box that you're ticking, but the link is there. And even if these elections were a baby step, they were a huge leap in terms of what's going to happen, in my view, in 2019, because now they've set a precedent. And I'm hoping that as we go on, we'll see much bigger European election campaigns, and that you will have that link directly with citizens. It's true that we have 3 presidents of Europe. You have the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Parliament, and the President of the European Council. There's a reason for this construction. And if you think the parallel in a member state, you have a parliament, you have a Senate, which is what I'd compare the European Council to, which is where all the member states sit, and then you have the executive, which is the European Commission. So merging those positions would not actually be terribly democratic, in my view. So I think it makes sense to have the 3 posts. Maybe down the line we can talk about, firstly, a directly elected president, and secondly, maybe a merging of the Commission and European Council posts. I think these are options. I'm not sure they're on the table just yet, but I think that we are definitely going to see very different elections in 2019 in terms of also their democratic legitimacy and the visibility that hopefully you'll see when you go to vote in the European Parliament elections in 2019, which I'm sure you will. And whether I think that would make a difference in this crisis, I think that this commission is already black and white compared to the commission before it. Already this small change has brought such a difference in the way that the European Commission interacts with member states, the way it acts with the European Parliament. It has so much more political legitimacy than it has done in the past. And the things that we are able to do, I have to say, are already going very far in terms of what the traditional role of the Commission has been.
First, thank you very much for your speech. I have one question which goes a bit more into the detail of the process of dealing with the crisis, or so-called crisis. It doesn't matter from which country you will resettle the refugees. There has to be a key which refugees you choose to resettle. Is there already an existing rule which families or which persons you resettle from one country to the other? Or is there some organ on level of the refugees that those themselves can decide who will be resettled? Or are there ideas?
Do you mean like who qualifies for asylum?
Yes, for example, if you will resettle on one day a few thousand from Turkey to Greece, or I don't know from where to where, how do you decide who will be resettled? Who will be allowed to change the country and who not?
Okay, 2 aspects to that. The first is who qualifies for asylum. How do you decide if this person needs international protection and that doesn't? That's not what you mean at all?
No, already if some person has asylum or fled from Syria to Greece, or yeah?
Yes, well, I mean, so either way, there has to be an individual examination of each and every case. That is crucial, because it's not because someone is from Morocco that they're not going to get asylum, and it's not because someone is from Afghanistan that they are. So there has to be on the individual merits of each person, because a country might be safe for one person, but it might not be safe in your individual case if you're being persecuted as a minority, etc. So every case gets examined individually, and when it comes to resettling people from outside of the European Union, we always work with the UNHCR, because they essentially go around and they identify a community of refugees, and they're the ones who then say to the European Union, okay, I've got 20,000 people here that could be resettled, that are in need of your protection. So we always work with them.
Hello. I mean, the theory about relocation, all that is fine. We'll see how that works out. Going a little bit further, though, having all these people here who have already had difficulties in the past, before the crisis, with defining our common identity and our common values in Europe. How is the immigration of, let's say, round about 2 million people from outside Europe, going to influence the definition of one common European identity? And how are you planning to cope with that?
Well, in terms of a common European identity, first you have to determine that exists before you can say whether it's going to be jeopardized by the entry of people from different cultural backgrounds. I mean, the European Union is a huge set of people from different cultural backgrounds. And it's already the case that the culture from one European country to the next is so different that, you know, you find great trouble integrating in that country. I, as a British-French person, do not necessarily integrate so easily into Belgium, but I'm working on it. But you know, there's always an adaptation wherever you go. I personally believe that the European Union was built on migration and on different communities living side by side, so I don't see how that would affect the integrity of a society. But then I think what you're also touching upon is integration policies. Is how do member states integrate themselves, foreign populations, into their populations. And this is something that hasn't been harmonized at European level. Each member state has very different integration policies. Harmonizing at the European level might be something that we have to look into in the future. It's something that we are already working on. But in terms of a European identity, this is something that's still very much being formed. And I think you only see the European identity when you look as a European to another part of the world. If you think, okay, so like I'm British, I'm not German, and I don't feel German, but when I look at the Americans or Asians, I might say, well, actually, I feel much closer to the German than I do to the American culture, because there are things that we have in common, whether it be the way we do data protection or the cheeses that we eat. There are commonalities that you find closer together in Europe than you do with our third partners.
Thank you very much. When talking about refugees with Turkey, do you take into account like the problematic democratic and human rights situation in Turkey currently?
Yes. Yes, of course we do. And nobody said that Turkey was an easy partner. They are a necessary partner. They're also a partner that we've been working with for decades. They first applied to be a member of the European Union in 1987. And part of that process has been bringing up standards in Turkey to the same European standards, and a big part of that is human rights, fundamental rights, respect for press freedom, and no one has taken that out of their minds in any of the dealings that we have with Turkey. But just because they are not to the same standard now doesn't mean that we can't, or that we shouldn't, or that we don't have to work with them now.
And if I may ask you, will Turkey become a member state of the European Union?
Maybe one day. I don't think it's for the immediate future, and my crystal ball's a little bit on the blink, but it is a candidate. We are negotiating accession with them, and if they meet the criteria, there's no reason that it shouldn't happen down the line. But at the end of the day, that's a collective decision at 28.
And a second question, if I may. There are a few European countries, Eastern European countries, who say that this refugee crisis is not a European crisis, but a German crisis. I think you know which countries I'm talking about. What do you, and what does the president respond to that?
He says politely that he tends not to agree. This is very much a Greek crisis as it is a German crisis. It is a collective European responsibility, and as European member states we have a duty, a treaty-bound duty, to show solidarity with one another, and we have a humanitarian duty to show solidarity with people who are suffering at our borders. So this is something that we have to approach collectively.
Great, there is another question. Is there, Lucas? Another question here? Somewhere? Last chance? David.
I know the professor.
We're talking about 2 million refugees at the most, right? And how many people have we got in Europe? 250, 300 million or more?
500.
400, right?
500.
So, 500. So we're talking a small percentage, correct? What is the biggest obstacles you think to country A, B, or C for accepting these refugees? What is it, an economic problem, or are they worried that their culture is going to change in their country, or what do you think it is?
I think it varies very much from member state to member state, and that's kind of the point that I was trying to make at the beginning about member states being so different and each having very different public opinions and also very different historical experiences as well. And if you look at the countries, the Eastern European countries, they have no tradition of having offered refuge to any large number of populations. In fact, most of the time they were the refugees. That were being accepted in Western Europe. And so it's also cultural differences which lead to varying public opinions, and states, democratically elected governments, are of course bound by those public opinions. And so the positions that they're taking in negotiating rooms are a reflection of what the majority in their society thinks. And so you have to take that into consideration.
All right, one last question. If there is one left, raise your arms, please, in case there is. Otherwise, thank you very, very much. You came here. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot,
Sure.
Natasha.
I hope it was okay.
It's been a pleasure to have you here. It's also been a pleasure to have you guys here. And yeah, please take a seat for a second, as I'm going to say something. Now, just some brief informations, and there's also a thank you slide for you. So, now just some brief information for the participants. The Mannheim Forum Night Party tonight starts at 10 p.m. at Tiffany. The address is 0725 here in Mannheim. We will also now take a picture of the participants. So, once again, in German. Party heute Abend im Tiffany, und wir werden jetzt noch ein Foto machen. Ich mache jetzt noch ein Foto. Wir machen jetzt ein Teilnehmerfoto. Ich würde euch dort hinten in den hinteren Reihen bitten, nach vorne zu kommen, hier vorne ein bisschen zusammenzurutschen, in der ersten Reihe ein paar Plätze freizulassen für uns. Und danach, bitte, tut mir den Gefallen, bleibt noch hier, weil wir haben den Mannheim Forum-Film für euch vorbereitet, der circa 3 Minuten noch dauert. Den würden wir euch dann noch zeigen. Und dann ist es zu Ende. Also bitte noch kurz hier bleiben.
Bevor ihr jetzt alle aufsteht und euch einmal umsetzt, möchte ich noch ein paar Worte verlieren, nämlich im Namen des gesamten Teams. Und dazu möchte ich einmal unseren Vorstand auf die Bühne bitten. Das sind Jakob, Iliana, der Simon ist ja schon da, und Lukas. Also, bevor wir jetzt das Teilnehmerfoto machen, bevor wir abbauen, bevor wir uns auf die Party heute Abend im Tiffany's freuen, exklusiv nur für uns, möchte ich ein paar Worte des Dankes an euch loswerden im Namen des gesamten Teams, und ich will es kurz machen. Danke für... Ein ganz großes Dankeschön für 4 Paar immer offene Ohren, für ein 24-Stunden-Sorgentelefon. Danke für eure Verlässlichkeit und Zielstrebigkeit bei der Erledigung von Aufgaben. Danke dafür, dass ihr immer da wart und uns kompetent unterstützt habt, wenn es mal Probleme gab. Danke für ganz viele tolle Team-Events, die da noch kommen werden, zum Beispiel die Weinprobe, auf die freue ich mich ganz besonders. Und um es ganz kurz zu machen, danke für ein wunderbares Jahr, an das wir uns alle immer sehr gerne zurückerinnern werden. Ich glaube, wir haben ein ganz gutes Event auf die Beine zusammengestellt. Und wir alle gemeinsam haben heute Abend Grund zu feiern. Und damit ihr heute Abend nicht ohne irgendwas in den Händen nach Hause geht, haben wir wunderschöne, marforote Blumensträuße für euch vorbereitet.
Jetzt möchte ich aber auch noch gerne was sagen. Es war uns, und da spreche ich jetzt, glaube ich, für uns 4, eine große Freude, mit euch zusammenarbeiten, mit euch Ressortleitern, aber auch mit dem ganzen Team, mit dem 60-köpfigen Team, mit den 40 Helfern. Es war ein tolles Jahr, uns hat es super viel Spaß gemacht und wir möchten uns auch, glaube ich, ganz herzlich bei euch allen bedanken. So, jetzt überbrücke ich mal die inhaltliche Lehre hier. Ich glaube, wir machen noch ein Bild, oder? Was sagt der Fotograf? Auf jeden Fall. Und weil es so schön war, würde ich gerade noch mal die Ressortleiter nach vorne bitten. Das sind Caroline Betz, Matthias Fertig, Anna Pautsch. Wo sind die anderen? Die sind alle gar nicht hier. Lukas, wo bist du? Lukas Krenz. Jakob Stein. Den habe ich noch vergessen. Tim Neumann. Tim Neumann. Da ist er. Habe ich den irgendwen vergessen? Habe ich alle? Ich glaube, ich habe alle. Ach, Naf ist auch da. Ist nicht da. Super. Und auch von mir ganz persönlich, ich hoffe, euch hat es super gefallen. Auch die Moderation meinerseits war hoffentlich erträglich und ich würde mich wirklich sehr, sehr freuen, wenn wir viele von euch, viele von den Gesichtern beim Mannheim Forum 2017 wiedersehen. Das wäre eine tolle Geschichte und ihr da oben, die ihr da steht, kommt rein, setzt euch, dann machen wir das Foto miteinander.